This is a production of Cornell University.
And thanks, Don, for inviting me, and for you all for coming, and also thanks for your contributions to EE capacity. We're really excited. Don's going to be teaching an online course. He's had several grad students helping him, and also it's in collaboration with Chicago Botanic Gardens and American Public Gardening Association. So, and that'll be starting in February, right? January? January. Okay, great. So, like probably a lot of you in this room, I actually think quite a bit about climate change. And I really like winter and cold weather, so I always feel kind of sad when we have those slushing events, or what we call ithicating events in the winter. I'd rather see snow. But I hadn't really done much about climate change education professionally for a long time, and I kind of considered myself almost as a climate change denier, and not like a denier in that I don't believe that climate change is occurring, but a denier in that I kept wishing that it would go away and that somebody else would solve the problem. I wouldn't have to worry about it. But when Hurricane Sandy occurred a couple of years ago, and I was in Ithaca, so I wasn't down in New York City, but the images and thinking about people I knew going through this. Some of you know Gretchen Ferenc, who recently retired from Cornell Cooperative Extension. She was in Far Rockaways, just taking the brunt of the storm. And then the media attention really made me sort of think about climate change education. I think in a way it was a tipping point for me in terms of my profession. And especially since, as Don mentioned, I direct EPA's National Environmental Education Training Program. It's a large cooperative agreement with EPA, 5 years, $11 million. And so I felt like as a leader in the field, I really needed to take more responsibility than I was taking. And so my presentation today is sort of about my search for what we should do in terms of the field of environmental education and how we should be addressing climate change education. Because I don't know all the answers, but I'll be talking about several projects that are helping me to find the answers, and we should have plenty of time for discussion at the end, so I'm hoping that some of these ideas will generate some discussion. Okay, so you saw the images, really kind of disturbing, scary. Do you need to turn down the lights a little bit? That would help. It's all the way in the back. Anyway, East 34th Street, the Midtown Tunnel. Okay, looks good, thank you. And then there was, as you know, a lot of media attention to climate change as a result of Hurricane Sandy, and especially Bloomberg, I think is really a leader in taking action in terms of mayors, nationally and internationally. So you kind of knew that people are going to rebuild. They're going to restore sites like this community garden before it was restored, after, and then after it was restored. So this is immediately after Hurricane Sandy. But we didn't really know how they'd rebuild, and if the sort of event would make them rebuild in different ways, if they would adapt and think about things differently as a result of this major event. And I'm particularly interested, since I'm in environmental education, interested in the learning opportunities that occur through community gardening or through another stewardship or civic ecology practice like this one, which is dune restoration after Hurricane Sandy. So people are planting dune grasses to try and restore the dunes to protect from high water events. But before I talk about Hurricane Sandy and how people reacted, in particular environmental educators, I wanted to give you a quick primer on environmental education for those of you who aren't familiar with the field. And basically, environmental education is about increasing knowledge and attitudes about the environment, but it's also about increasing people's ability to make informed decisions and take responsible action. So, as a land-grant university, we do a lot of science education. And we kind of think of our mission as extending the science-based knowledge to the people of the state and beyond. So we more stick to science knowledge. And environmental education also incorporates science knowledge. We do a lot of environmental sciences education, so to speak. But we add on civic engagement, and it's also a very normative or values-driven field. So we're doing this for a purpose, and that is to hopefully encourage environmentally responsible behaviors and then increase environmental quality. So I think that's a bit different from science education per se. But there's a couple of problems with environmental education, and I think this one also applies to science education. And so that is that basically knowledge, even though we assume that, say, if people know more about climate change, then they'll act according to the ways we'd like them to act. So, but knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to action. So these two figures are taken from a paper by Dan Kahan, who's at Yale University. And so if you look at this first one, on the y-axis, you have climate science intelligence. So how much they know, how many correct responses they get on a survey or a test about climate science. And if you look across here, it's people's positions on global warming. So whether you believe your position is that there's no warming occurring, warming is naturally caused, or warming is human induced, doesn't have any correlation with how much you know about climate science. And if you can see this bottom graph here, it kind of explains what does determine our positions on climate change. So how much you perceive global warming as a risk, whether it's extremely high risk or not a risk at all, has a whole lot to do with whether you identify yourself as a very liberal, strong Democrat or a very conservative, strong Republican. Right? So it has less to do. They've actually had some other graphs in this paper that show that the Republicans may have just as much knowledge as the Democrats, but how they react is determined by our identity, essentially, what political identity that we assume. And another problem with knowledge, the assumption that knowledge leads to action, can be viewed through this lens of terror management theory. I don't know how many of you know my colleague, Janice Dickinson. She wrote a paper in 2009. It's in Ecology and Society. And she synthesized a whole bunch of empirical studies about, that are going through using the lens of terror management theory. And then she applied that to how we think about or how we react to climate change. So the whole idea here is that if I were to tell you that global warming is occurring, it's a disaster, you know, we're not going to be able to produce the crops we're producing in New York State, we're going to have droughts, we're going to have flooding, and what's more, we're going to have diseases, and it's going to be total devastation, then I might make you feel vulnerable. So what you want to do is then make yourself feel invincible, less vulnerable. I mean, we see this with, I apologize, this is a little sexist, but you know, guys, when they get to sort of be the midlife crisis, they like to buy SUVs or trucks or nice little sport car convertibles. They might be feeling a little age-related vulnerability, and they want to be invincible. Well, when Sarah Palin and her colleagues, or her supporters, you know, they were getting sort of bombarded by sort of drilling in Alaska and the environmentalists, well, they really made themselves feel really strong and invincible by talking about drill, baby, drill. And I don't know how many of you can see this guy here, but he looks a lot to me like Vladimir Putin. And we all know how close Russia is to Alaska, so maybe he was there, and he probably believes in drill, baby, drill too. So, but the idea is this terror management theory is that we might have reactions unintended, or people might have reactions that we didn't intend when we tell them how bad things are, because they want to make themselves feel less vulnerable. Okay, so another problem with environmental education is that the type of action that environmental education often, not always, but often sort of tries to foster is individual behaviors usually. Not always, but it's often like, okay, reduce water while you're taking a shower, while you're brushing your teeth. Walk to work instead of drive to work. And when you consider the scale and the magnitude is sort of the timing that it's here already, global warming, as well as the magnitude of the issue, I think there's a bit of a scale mismatch in some of the behaviors that we promote and what's needed. And then also the idea of mitigation versus adaptation. So environmental education has almost totally been focused on mitigating our impact on global warming, right? So we're reducing our energy use, we're reducing our use of plastics, for example, we're recycling. So we're trying to mitigate human impact on climate change or on the environment. But given what we know about climate change that is already here, I think the field really needs to think about adaptation. And this is one of the reasons I avoided this for a long time, is because for adaptation, it's almost like you're being a turncoat if you're an environmental educator, or you're sort of giving up the fight because you're all of a sudden saying that, you know, we're not just going to try to conserve what we have, we're also going to face reality and adapt to what's already happening. So just in summary, 3 issues that I think face our field of environmental education and are why we need to think about changes in our practice of environmental education or in our discipline. And they are that knowledge doesn't necessarily lead to behavior change, scale mismatch of the actions that we foster or promote versus what's occurring with global warming, and then the need to consider adaptation. So I'm going to but I don't really know how we should change. So one of the things that I did, I like to think of it as crowdsourcing. There's 3 projects that I'll discuss today that we're using to help us figure out how our field might evolve or change. And the first one is actually a research project where we looked at New York City environmental educators who experienced Sandy. And then I'm going to talk about it's really an outreach or extension type project, Climate Change Environmental Education Fellows. And then we also convened a panel of national experts in global warming and environmental education to help us understand what they thought the field should be doing. Okay, so the first one, we looked at New York City environmental educators after Sandy, and the question we asked was, how did their programs respond to the event, to the superstorm? And out of a sample of over, I think it's about 2,000 environmental stewardship organizations in New York City, and these have been documented and mapped by the U.S. Forest Service, Urban Field Station, Urban Research Station in the city. And they include everything from, you know, major sort of policy organizations to these small-scale community gardens, so that's why there's a lot. And we took a sample of 45 that we thought, it was a purposeful sample, that we thought were most likely to be engaged in environmental education. And we interviewed them, open-ended interviews, conducted site visits, and then analyzed these open-ended responses to look at what themes might come out. And I should say that the majority of this work was conducted by a person who works for me in New York City, and his name's Bryce Dubois. Okay, so we found 2 kinds of changes. One was in the programs, the actual environmental education programs that people were conducting, and the other was in the organizations that were doing these programs. And I'm just going to talk about the first, the program changes. And there were 3 that kind of emerged through these interviews. One was that organizations or programs were reinforcing existing content. Second was that they were conducting new types of stewardship or restoration activities. And the third was that they were incorporating this notion of resilience quite a bit into their programs. So an example of reinforcing existing activities. Green Map is an organization in New York City, and they map green spaces, green places around the city, so that people, if they want to visit a community garden, or they want to go to the Highline Park, or they want to go to another small or large park, they can kind of know where these green spaces are. And after Hurricane Sandy, they simply imposed places that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy on their maps, and also thought of them as opportunities where they might restore some of this green space. So this sort of idea of really reinforcing what you're already doing was quite common. And I think another example is a school, and it was in Queens, and they had been teaching about energy for water resources. And they simply used Hurricane Sandy then as examples for what they'd already been teaching about, because kids were very aware of energy since their energy was cut off, sometimes for several weeks. So a second type of change was new environmental stewardship activities. This one's with the Breezy Point Green Committee. And again, for those of you who know Gretchen Ferens, this is her neighborhood in the Rockaways, and she was a leader of this activity. And I showed another slide earlier, but the idea of trying to restore dunes to reduce the impact of future high water events. And we weren't really surprised that people were engaging in these stewardship activities, not just because they think it can protect them against a future event, but because our past research, and this is Keith Tidball in my lab and myself, we've seen over and over again how after a disaster or during times of conflict, people often turn to gardening and other forms of greening as a response. And it's more sort of their individual psychological resilience in a lot of cases, although they may also say it's going to bring their neighborhood or their ecosystem back. So just as other examples, after 9/11, we saw a lot of memorial gardens sort of spontaneously created. They might take a median strip and plant there, or take a community garden and add some daffodils to it as a memorial garden. And Keith worked a lot after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and he found a lot of tree planting and tree care, which is consistent with New Orleans and the idea of the live oaks and how important they are to the identity of the city. And as Don mentioned, we captured all that in this examples really from around the world. We have, this is an edited volume, but we have somebody from Berlin who talked about the greening of the Berlin Wall after the fall of communism. So and there's lots and lots of examples of this greening in what we call red zones. So the third kind of change was this incorporation of resilience and resilience speak into these programs. And these are a couple examples. Uprose is a community organization in Brooklyn, and they created a climate justice community resilience center. And then Grow New York City, they created this resilient New York City community gardening guide. So it's how people can address issues like saltwater inundation of their soils and trees falling in the middle of their gardens and so forth. And it's probably not surprising that people are using this term resilience, because Bloomberg actually created this new resilience guide as part of Plan New York City, which, well, he's no longer there as mayor, but was his sustainability plan for the city. But also this term resilience is really popping up everywhere. And I think that people often don't know what they're referring to, because it's the term has so many different meanings. There's individual or psychological resilience, there's ecological resilience, there's engineering resilience, and there's social ecological systems resilience, just to name a few. And so Bryce Dubois and I now, we're following up with some of these groups in New York City to determine what they really mean by resilience. And I was in New York City giving a talk last Friday, and somebody said that the term resilience is very resilient. And then we had a resilience workshop last Friday that DSOC put on in Mann Library, and somebody said the same thing. So, but just to show you how much this term is catching on, I was reading the journal, our own Ithaca journal this morning. Oh, actually it's USA Today Ithaca journal, but anyways. And they say, Hoboken, New Jersey, Paul finds that neighborliness matters. Neighbor helping neighbor, trust in a community, looking out for each other. An Associated Press NORC Center for Public Affairs Research survey suggests that those factors, collectively termed social resilience, have a big impact on how prepared communities feel for disasters such as Superstorm Sandy. 37% of residents in areas reporting high levels of neighbors helping each other are very or extremely confident their neighborhood would recover quickly from a disaster, compared to 22% in areas with lower levels of neighborly cooperation. I think they probably would have called this social capital or social connections or something else a few years ago, but now it's becoming social resilience. Okay, so my question that I addressed in this part of the talk was whether Hurricane Sandy was really a tipping point for environmental education and environmental educators in New York City, and sort of whether it stretched the limits of what they were doing and they went over, sort of broke with what they were doing in the past. And I would say that the answer is probably no. There were a bunch of small innovations, but it wasn't as I'd sort of maybe hoped for, that they came up with all the solutions of how we should address global warming in environmental education. So I'm going to turn to the next project. And this is a project that's part of that National Environmental Education Training Program that Don mentioned. And we have a fellows program. They're called Community Climate Change Fellows. And what we did, we have 26 people. They were selected from a group from across the country and in Mexico and Canada. And we did a workshop with them for a week. They came together. And as a result of this workshop and the resources we're putting into them, they're supposed to do some local community climate change interventions. And so again, we're kind of looking for what do these practitioners in the field come up with and what can we learn from them. So what I want to do now is share with you, here's just some of the fellows. As I mentioned, we have 26. But I wanted to share with you a couple of the projects they came up with. So this one's by Jason Davis, and he's in Boston. He's actually a musician. And he came up with this idea of recording climate change stories. And I want to play one for you. And I want to ask you to think about whether this story feels impactful to you, about how you think about climate change and whether it might move you or maybe even make you think differently or want to do something differently.
My name is Fred Small. I'm the senior minister at First Parish in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Unitarian Universalist. One of the special places to me is the coast of Maine, where my wife's family has had a place for generations on Penobscot Bay. My wife and I have kayaked all along the Maine coast and up off Nova Scotia. I grew up in New Jersey, which is not that dissimilar a climate, and I'm a four seasons guy. It's the changing of the seasons that excites me. There's something about that cycle of seasons that is very nourishing to me. Reading Bill McKibben's book, The End of Nature, in 1989 was painful for me and many of us. I think it just began a decades-long season of grief. So that what might have been a beautiful, sometimes called Indian summer day, just a kind of gift, like, wow, what a beautiful day. It's so warm and pleasant here in October or November or December, then becomes an omen, something disturbing. My daughter is 11, and she's already said that she wished she had been born earlier because she doesn't look forward to what is in store for her and her generation. And as a parent, that breaks my heart to hear. Bad things are going to happen, but bad things have happened before in human history. Very, very bad things. The Great Plague in Europe, the Holocaust, slavery, all kinds of suffering. Some, if you will, natural. Some perpetrated by human depravity. That isn't to minimize it, but to say that we do have the capacity to get through this. But what I think is crucial is that we've got to do it with love and not lose our spiritual center or our moral compass as we go. So for me, as a religious leader, the question is not, are we going to win or are we going to lose? Because in a sense, we've already lost. We've lost tremendous amounts of people and species and good things that we will not be able to recover. And I think it's going to get worse. So the question is not winning or losing, but, if you will, how we play the game. Do we stay loving? Do we stay compassionate? Do we treat each other well? Do we treat our enemies well? Do we love our enemies, as Jesus challenged us to do?
So you could...
My name is Charlie Dennis.
Oops, sorry about that.
First Nations and
I'll stop this.
Cape of Nova Scotia and
Unless you all want to hear some more. But you can see that he has a bunch of, he's recorded a bunch of these climate change stories from people in the US and Canada. There was one from Poland, and you can go onto his website and listen to others if you think that they're worthwhile. And then I wanted to play you, this one's 2 minutes, 22 seconds. One of our climate change fellows, Maria Tolero, just made a video of herself. It's kind of pieces of different lectures, and she covers a lot of the points that I think are important, so I wanted to show that one also.
So this is a difficult topic, the topic of climate change, and maybe more specifically global warming. But it's also a difficult topic because if you think about it, there's no place to go to work on, not the science, but to work on, these human questions of how can I relate to this? Every workshop that I do is tailored for the group that I'm presenting to. But I want us to work together to expand our concept of what it means to be a climate change activist. In traditional presentations, I would now bombard you with, the worst news imaginable. And you would think, oh my God, I wish I hadn't come here this morning. How much weight do the people you're trying to reach give to what scientists have to say? What role does that play in their life? I think we often operate under the assumption that everybody's ready to hear through the scientific channel. Maybe there's a part of you that wants to just kind of reach in and do something on a scale appropriate to the size of the problem. Business as usual is built into the very way we perceive the world around us. Our social workspaces show us the world as a place where we should preserve and maintain our personal status quo. If we can change our social workspaces, we can change our perception of reality. And when we change our perception of reality, our actions will change. We need urgently to let go of the idea that it's the stressed, overscheduled individual in each of us who needs to wake up, single-handedly activate her moral conscience, step up and take action. Instead, we need to look at the social workspaces we're already sharing with others and ask, what kind of potential is there here for transforming them? What would it take for you to join a nonviolent resistance movement on climate change? There is no easy solution, but there is something we can do. And I want to argue that something we can do is join the movement. Help create a powerful grassroots movement that moves the needle.
Okay, so those are just two of our fellows, Jason Davis and Maria Tolero, and each one, as I mentioned, is doing a different project. And if you're interested in more, I could share with you some of the other projects that they're doing. There we go. So to conclude, this is the second project is, the question is, what is the impact of each of these individual projects, and is there a way really we can make a larger project through the group of fellows along with our staff on the EE capacity project, and we have lots of other collaborators across the country. I found that those both the video and the audio were very impactful, but whether it makes an impact at sort of a larger level, I think is a question. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the third and the final project, and that is that we convened a panel of national experts, and we asked them to address the question, is environmental education that focuses on small individual actions appropriate given the scale of climate change? So here are our experts. We had John Carey, who's a freelance environmental journalist, John Fraser, who's an environmental ed and science ed researcher in New York City, he works nationally, Carrie Fulton, who's with the Environmental Justice Climate Change Initiative in Washington, D.C., and Caroline Lewis, who I think a number of you know. I don't know if anybody knows her besides Don, but she used to work at Fairchild Botanic Garden and now in Miami, and now she's started her own organization, Climate Leadership Engagement Opportunities, or CLEO, again operating in Miami, which is ground zero, as you probably know, of climate change and of sort of the mix of very conservative politics and people who are addressing climate change daily. And in fact, the mayor of South Miami, because Miami has all these little cities that are sort of part of the larger metropolitan, there's a movement down there for them to secede from the state of Florida because the people in northern Florida don't believe in climate change, but they see it in their everyday lives with all the flooding and I mean, my daughter lives there, so I know on her way to work she's often walking through water. And then Billy Spitzer from the New England Aquarium. And I think there's 5 themes that came out of this workshop. And I should mention there were about 90 people from New York City, environmental educators and related professionals. So this came out of the discussions amongst the experts and with the people who participated. And the first is about emotion, and that environmental education should really be considering how we help people cope with emotions. And these emotions can be the sort of feelings of vulnerability and climate change denial that I discussed earlier when I mentioned terror management theory. But they can also be these feelings of sadness and loss, I think, as the minister in that video, in the audio talked about. And it's really hard when you think about, are you just telling, say, young people about the science of climate change and what's going to happen, and then you have to sort of, what do you do about how they react to this? So the second is environmental justice. And I find this one really interesting, not only because it's sort of about a movement and that there's already an environmental justice movement and that we can join forces with them and then maybe have a larger impact, but it's also really interesting because I think the civil rights movement has possibly some lessons for us in dealing with climate change. So, you can imagine what a sort of overwhelming problem civil rights or racial inequities were to people in the 60s and 50s, and yet there was a really well-organized, sort of starting at the grassroots movements that made incredible changes in our society. So there may be things we can learn about how they organized and how they worked. Okay, third is collective action, and this is the idea that we need to think about not just these individual behavior changes that we've thought about in the past, like changing our water use at a home level, but also more collectively how we can make a change. And Maria Tellero really spoke about that in the video. I think that if we're going to think about collective action, one of the things we might do is think about what the research is, largely coming out of sociology, that talks about what are the elements that are usually present before collective action occurs. And one of them is social capital, or trust and connections between people, as well as social norms. So instead of sort of starting an environmental ed program with what is climate change and global warming, you might start a program with thinking about, well, how do we create some social connections and trust amongst the people, and how do we create strong social norms? And then the theory would predict that people have more capacity to act collectively to address these issues. Advocacy education, and this one is really the most controversial. So it's not just controversial for science educators, it's also really controversial for environmental educators, and in part because the field has been criticized extensively for being advocates and being left-wing, socialist, communist, whatever. And so the reaction has been to really retreat from any of this normative stuff and just say, well, we're going to teach the facts and then we're going to help people to make their own decisions. And yet I think, given the scale again of the problem, I think we should reconsider this. And again, I think we can look back at the civil rights movement. So think about us as a land-grant institution and think about the 50s or 60s. And we would think, well, our role is to do, and it's too bad Scott Peters isn't here because he would have a lot to say about this, but our role is just to sort of transfer what's known about race or something like that, based on the science. And if you look back on it now, we might say that would have been quite irresponsible or even immoral. So is there a parallel here with climate change? And then the last is climate change is the new normal. I talked about that earlier, explicitly acknowledging that the Earth has changed. And we can't really conserve our natural heritage, at least in many cases, as we might have tried to do before. So I said I'd present 3 different projects, but I'm going to do a little bit more in depth on this last project. In particular, I want to talk about adaptation in relation to climate change as the new normal. So climate change simply means adjustments in ecological, social, climate adaptation means adjustments in ecological, social, or economic systems in response to climate change. And if you look at the IPCC report that just came out this year, they have 3 different major categories of adaptation options. So there's physical, structural, social, which has to do with equity issues, and then institutional, which has to do with changing government agencies or nonprofits or international organizations. But within each of those categories, they have subcategories that I think, and I've just chosen the ones that I think are most consistent with environmental education. So ecosystem-based under physical structural, community-based, and education under social, and engagement under institutional. By the way, this I just picked up last night. I think it was on a BBC article, and it's about Boston re-envisioning itself as Venice. So this is actually,
or Amsterdam.
Yeah, they mentioned Amsterdam also. Okay, so ecosystem-based adaptation is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services to help communities and people adapt to climate change. And so we can think of, again, this falls under physical structural, so we can think of seawalls or putting all our utilities on the second floor of buildings where they're on flood zones or high water zones. But we can also think about sort of plantings, oyster reefs, oyster restoration. There's a huge effort on oyster restoration in New York City estuary right now as sort of more consistent with the environmental values of environmental education. And community-based adaptation, which are locally driven adaptation strategies that operate on a learning by doing bottom-up and empowerment paradigm. And here I like to think of community gardens as a really good example of a community-based adaptation. And the reason is because I think people in community gardens, they engage in these kinds of discussions, as Megan knows and has helped them with. And they have to make a lot of decisions, right? So they have to decide, okay, how do we decide who gets a plot? How do we decide on whether pesticides are allowed? And if somebody lets their weeds grow, what kind of sanctions are we going to have? And there's been some work done by Erica Svensson in New York City at that Forest Service Urban Research Station, looking at how what goes on, this decision making in these little kind of interventions and the empowerment that people get, how it scales up. So these are, I like to think of these as kind of training grounds. And a lot of times the people that are in community gardens are immigrants and they may not have participated in civil society previously. And then, sometimes people that have been in these gardens and been in decision-making roles or participated in these discussions then go on and they become advocates at a larger scale, like for preserving green space in New York City. So I think that there's a lot of these kinds of civic ecology practices or greening practices that we can think of as combining ecosystem-based, community-based, and education adaptation. In other words, they provide opportunities for environmental learning, even though there might not be a formal education program there. And these can be things like restoring wetlands and salt marshes to buffer against sea level rise, and installing green infrastructure such as this green roof garden in New York City, as well as porous pavements and community gardens. So, getting back to my original question, was Superstorm Sandy a tipping point for environmental education? Probably not, but I do think that there's a lot of new ideas being generated that we can follow up on. And so we are seeing changes in EE, and some of the major changes I think we're seeing are the use of the terms resilience and people starting to think about adaptation, these environmental stewardship like the dune restoration practices, more thinking about collective action, and then reconsidering the notion of advocacy given the scale of the issues. So with that, I'd like to thank my colleagues Bryce Dubois, Judy Browse, Ann Ferguson, and John Fraser, who have helped me think about some of these issues, as well as my funders. But because I talked about advocacy, views expressed are not necessarily those of the funding agencies. So
thank you so much, Marianne.
Thank you.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.